Okay. This session will center around Venerable Aniruddha, Venerable Maha Kasapa, and Venerable Angulimala.
Ven Amarasiri, I think our members would just like to show our respects to you by bowing 3 times, if you would allow us.
Please.
Everyone can just bow.
Thank you. My bows in return. Okay, so as usual, let's start by paying homage to our teachers, invoking a feeling of gratitude, invoking a feeling of devotion, and by chanting our usual Itipiso. Itipiso Bhagavara Sampa Sambuddho Vijja Charana Sampanno Sugato Lokavidho Anuttaro Purisa Dhamma Sarati Satta Deva Manusanang Buddho Bhagava Tisavakato Bhagavata Dhammo Samdittiko Akadi Ehi Pasiko Pachatam Veti Pujo Patipanno Bhagavato Sabaka Sangho Nyaya Patipanno Bhagavato Sabaka Sangho Michi Patipanno Bhagavato Sabaka Sangho Yadidanchatari Purisa Gani Atta Purisa Pukkalaye Sabhagavato Sabaka Sangho Ahuneyo Pahuneyo Dakhineyo Anjali Karaniyo Anuttarang Punya Ketam Lokasati. Okay. So, like I said, this session is about Venerable Aniruddha, Venerable Maha Kasapa, and Venerable Angulimala. Now, before we get into this week's topics, there were 2 things that I wanted to do. First thing was that last week, or the last time we met, the session got a little long and I missed out the last slide from Venerable Ananda. And that was a really, really lovely slide. So we'll look at that. And then there's one question from last week's session. So I'll try and answer that question and then we'll move on. So this was the last slide from the previous slide deck. And the story goes that there was this layperson who is a very devoted person. He's full of confidence in the Buddha's teachings. And then he goes to the Buddha and asks him, says, oh, we always talk about paying homage to the triple gem. You're there, you're flesh and blood. So it's easy for me to pay respects to you. The Sangha is also there, flesh and blood, easy for me to pay homage to the Sangha. But then this thing called the Dhamma, the teachings, it seems a little abstract. How does one pay homage to it? And to that, the Buddha responds, if you wish to honor the Dhamma, household herb, go and honor Ananda, the guardian of the Dhamma. So it was a lovely piece of validation of Ananda's work, Ananda's devotion, lovely appreciation from his teacher and a good friend. And so I thought that was a fitting tribute to end last session's slide deck on. Okay. So I know the question is a little long, but basically, this question's, I think it's from Karen Tan. And she says, in the Vajrayana tradition, guru devotion is an integral part of their practice. Okay. Practice in Sanskrit is sadhana, also derived from the word saddha. So her question is, how is intuitive awareness, trust in the knowing that is spoken and pointed out by Lumpur's Viradhammo and Sumedho, facilitated by guru devotion? What makes devotion so important in this practice? How do we practice devotion in our own lives without making the teacher or his teaching an object of awareness? And I think the rationale to that question is any object in awareness is a conditioned response and therefore is still in the threshold of samsara, therefore not liberation, as LPB often points out. So even before I get into each of the individual questions, I'd like to start by saying that language has its deficiencies. Language has its limitations, right? But then language does two things very, very well. Language puts us on the path of inquiry, puts us on the path of reflection, and at the same time, language evokes, right? It makes us feel. So when we talk of the Buddha Dhamma, though a lot of it is based on reflection, it is still a very evocative teaching. There's a lot of it that evokes. There's a lot of it that arises within. There's a lot of it. So even when the Buddha, in his first sermon, he says, Chakkum udapadi, vision arose. Aloko udapadi, light arose, right? So it's an evocative thing. The Dhamma is very, very evocative. So when we talk of intuitive awareness, knowing, consciousness, however you want to use it, it is just, it's a word. It's pointing, it directs to an internal experience. So the encouragement is to Lumpur Sumedho's encouragement, Lumpur V's encouragement from all our wonderful teachers, is to look at what arises within. So that's at a very, very high level, right? At a slightly lower level, how does devotion facilitate awareness? Well, to be absolutely practical, devotion is just another object in awareness, right? His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says that metta is the method, it's not the goal. Devotion is the method. Devotion is a tool that is used. So we start by considering the teachings of a person and amulaka saddha. So we try and find the root in it. Does it really work? And we try and find the reason in it. Akaravati saddha. Does it kind of, is it for my benefit or is it for my detriment? Is this teaching going to take me to a good destination? Is this teaching going to take me closer to the end of suffering? Is this teacher a teacher who I can rely on? Is this a refuge that's safe, that's secure? So all of these evaluations happen. And as a result of all these evaluations, there's a conviction that arises. There's a confidence that arises, right? And with that confidence, there is an opening of the heart. There's trust. There's love. And so that is what shines as the object in awareness. Now, from a very, very kind of basic point of view, just as there's this glass, my eye sees the glass, my brain notes what my eye sees and then remembers that it's a glass, and then awareness knows that my mind is seeing my mind is seeing what the eye is seeing, and that's the glass. Now that is at a very basic level, but at a little more deeper level, we ask ourselves, okay, what does this actually evoke? So if I see a glass, it doesn't evoke anything. It evokes a very neutral feeling. But if I perceive someone who I really love and respect, what does it evoke? Right? So that's what I would like to say to that question. Instead of trying to find out how this facilitates that, find out what does it evoke? What is the, if you think about your guru and if you think about devotion, what is it that you actually feel? What makes devotion so important in this practice? Well, just as we saw last week, it is the starting point of the practice, right? Saddha, then coupled with sila and samadhi and panya, makes for a very potent combination. And Saddha is what gives rise to enthusiasm. Saddha is what gives rise to energy. So it's absolutely essential in the spiritual path and in spiritual practice. Now, how do we practice devotion in our own lives without making the teacher or his teachings an object in awareness? Well, the Buddha actually says, make the teachings an object of your awareness. He always keeps, like, one example is when Mahamoggalana is dealing with a lot of sloth and torpor, the Buddha tells him, well, Mahamoggalana, do all of these things, and if these things don't work, then bring the teaching to mind. Inspire yourself by recollecting the teachings, right? So it's not so much that, and when we have to bring in an object in awareness, that object has to be, let me put it this way. Whenever there's an object in awareness, that object is conditioned. There are times when awareness is aware of its own nature, which is absolutely empty. Now, we are told that's what happens when we are in deep sleep. Sometimes you can feel it when we are meditating, where everything just stops, the mind goes blank. There is no object in awareness. There is no object in consciousness. That's when awareness knows itself. The chitta knowing the chitta, the mind knowing the mind. Chitte chittanupasi viharati, as it says in the Satipatthana Sutta. The chitta knows the chitta and abides, right? So when there is no object, what awareness is aware of is emptiness or its own nature. But then usually, if there is an object, that object is typically something that's conditioned. Right? We do need a boat to take us to the other shore. If we don't have a boat, how can we get to the other shore? But then there will be but there will be a time where we are focused on this object, and of its own accord, the object fades away, and the object drops away. And what we are left with is just pure awareness. So don't worry about all of these things. To make a good cup of cappuccino, you need good milk, you need good decoction, you need good sugar, right? Once the cappuccino is mixed, there's no point in saying, where's the coffee, where's the sugar, where's the milk? Enjoy the cappuccino. So that's how you sit and meditate, right? You get devotion, you get awareness, what's the problem? So look at the evocative aspect rather than the kind of intellectual, analytical aspect. That would be, but that's just me, right? That's just my encouragement. Okay, so now let's get into this week's topic. So, Karen, I hope that answered your questions. As I've tried answering it as well as I could. If you have follow-ups, please email Nitya or Marjorie. Right. So now we are talking about Venerable Aniruddha. Now, Venerable Aniruddha, again, one of the Buddha's principal disciples, and he was also the Buddha's half-brother, Buddha's cousin, sorry, Ananda's half-brother. Buddha's father, Suddhodana, apparently had a brother called Amitodana. Amitodana had, I suppose, a few wives. The sons of one of the wives was Ananda. The sons from the other wife were Aniruddha and Mahanama, and probably a few other children too. So it's very interesting when we look at the early life of Venerable Aniruddha, and the Pali Canon tells us that the story of Venerable Aniruddha is not really different from the story of the Buddha, right? They were cousins, they grew up in the same kind of environment. Obviously, Venerable Aniruddha's family was very, very well off. Now, Venerable Aniruddha was a very jolly child. He had lots of friends, and he was a very generous person. He loved sharing and he loved giving. So the story goes that one day there were lots of friends, and he kept asking his mother for cakes. So his mother sends some cakes, and then all his friends eat, and then they want more. So he asks for more 2 or 3 times, and around the 4th or 5th time, he sends the servant back to his mum for more cakes. And the mum sends a servant back saying, there are no more cakes. And in Pali, natti puvang. Puvang is cake, natti means no more. So no more cakes. And the texts tell us that it was impossible for Venerable Aniruddha to understand this concept that there's no more. He was so used to getting whatever he wanted. He was so used to getting how much ever of that he needed or wanted, that he just couldn't understand the idea that there was no more. So he thought Natti Puvang is again the name of a type of cake. He just couldn't understand that there was no more cake. So he sends the servant back, and the mother, just to teach him a lesson, sends an empty bowl with the servant. And the devatas are so pleased with Aniruddha because probably of his past good deeds, that they fill up this empty bowl with cakes, and they do it over and over again. And Aniruddha and his friends have an inexhaustible supply of cake. Lovely story, right? But then what it does show is Venerable Aniruddha's upbringing. He was never refused any. And so one day, what happens is Venerable, there's the Buddha is enlightened. He's taught his first sermon, and then he's gone around teaching a little bit, and then he visits Kapilavatthu again. And then all of his family sees him. And now there's talk within this group of young Sakyan nobles that we must now go and ordain under the Buddha, right? His teachings are so profound. It leads to the end of suffering. So many people are benefiting from it. We should also go, and we should benefit from this teaching, benefit from this training, dedicate ourselves to this life that the Buddha is talking about. So Venerable Aniruddha's brother, Mahanama, goes to Venerable Aniruddha and says, why don't you ordain? Why don't you go forth? Now Venerable Aniruddha is a little shocked, right? He says, me? I've been brought up in the lap of luxury. I'm really delicate. I've grown up getting everything I want. How can I leave home and go into homelessness? So then Mahanama tells him, well, yes, you do have all this, but at some point you're going to grow up and you have to take responsibility. And we have fields, and that's where we get our money from. So the seed has to be sown. Well, first of all, the field has to be plowed, then the seeds have to be sown, then they have to be watered, then the water has to be drained, and then the seeds have to be, the crop has to be harvested, it has to be threshed, etc., 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 and then it has to be stored, and then it has to be sold. And that's when we get our money. And Anuruddha is a little surprised and he says, oh, okay. And then Mahanama says, well, and the whole thing starts again next year. So every time, this is what happens. Every season, this is what happens. It's time and time again. So then Venerable Anuruddha, this kind of stops his usual way of thinking and he kind of considers this and then he says, well, when is the end of work? Mahanama says, well, in this life, there's really no end. That's why it's called samsara. It keeps rolling, right? There is no end. So then the light comes on and Anuruddha says, wow, okay, this is what the Buddha is talking about. This is the wheel that the Buddha is stopping. This is the work that needs to come to an end. So now he's actually quite enthused and he sees value in this. So he goes and asks his mother, Mother, can I go and ordain? Mom says, no, obviously who would want their son to go forth? And especially if the son is brought up in the lap of luxury and the son's going to inherit, and da, 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 da. So the mother says, no, you can't. Then he's not about to give up. So then the mother lays a condition. Says, okay, do you know this chieftain Baddiya? If Baddiya goes forth, then I'll give you permission to go forth. And this is because she knows for sure that Baddiya is not going to give up his position, not going to give up his position of power, give up his inheritance, and then just go forth into the homeless life. So now Anuruddha sees a ray of hope, goes to Baddiya and says, hey, let's both go forth together. Baddiya is still a little caught up. He says, yeah, he's about to say, yes, let's do it. But then something stops him and he says, I'd really love to, but give me 7 years. In 7 years' time, I'll settle all of my affairs and then both of us will go forth together. Anuruddha says, nah, that's impossible. 7 years is too long a time. And then he's so persistent that he keeps arguing, presenting counter arguments, convinces Baddiya that they must go forth. So finally, Baddiya agrees. And then the story of about how these 6 nobles and Upali, their Barber, that is Baddiya, Bagu, Ananda, Anuruddha, Kimbila, and Devadatta, the evil one, all of them they're all Sakyan nobility. So all of them leave under the guise, they take the Barber along and they leave as if they're going on a picnic. And then they send their escort back and they go and they ordain with the Buddha. So it's a very interesting story because this kind of paradigm shift that Venerable Anuruddha goes through, where he has no need for anything. Every whim and fancy is satisfied, yet he knows that he has to, this isn't it, right? He is looking for the end of the work, right? And so that inspires him to go forth. Some of his unique strengths are that he was known to have been the most excellent in the divine eye. So he was this kind of absolutely superb clairvoyant in the Sangha. And another very, very, very important, sorry, Tim? Yes?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Venerable. I just wanted to let you know that the slide deck doesn't seem to be moving along with your talk. We're still seeing the original, the opening slide. So I just thought you'd want to know.
Oh,
Sorry to.
really? What do you see Venerable Aniruddha? Hold on.
No, we see the slide the opening slide that's titled Tisarana Buddhist Monastery, Great Lives Inspiring Right Practice.
Okay. Give me a moment, please. I get my tech expert.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Right there. Okay, well, thanks for stopping me. I had no idea. Thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. We'll make sure this doesn't happen next week. Okay, so early life, going forth, unique strengths. And the other unique strength that Venerable Aniruddha had was that he was foremost in his realization of using the Satipatthanas, the four bases of mindfulness, to reach ultimate understanding. So he was absolutely mindful, and he was always in touch with the four foundations of mindfulness, regardless of whatever he was doing. He used that as his primary practice. So these are two things that he's extremely noted for. And then, of course, we'll talk about his personal traits in a little bit, right? But suffice to say that one of the things that we recognize right off the bat, is that he's this excellent negotiator, especially the way he goes to Baddiya and then convinces him that, no, you don't need 7 years. You don't need 7 months. You don't need 7 weeks. You don't need 7 days. We go forth right now, right? That kind of ability to convince, ability to draw, ability to kind of carry people along with his ideas and with his thoughts. And so, along with his legacy, we can also see some of his personal traits as well, in that first and foremost, he could really see the value of renunciation. Not that any of the others couldn't, but then when we read some of his teachings, when we read some of the suttas in which he is the primary character, when the Buddha questions him, or when he's having conversations with other monks, he always comes back to this theme, value of renunciation. And that's something he holds really very, very, very dear to himself. Because if he did not renounce, he could see the link that without renunciation, there's no end to worldly work. We'll still be sowing seeds, reaping, storing, selling, etc., right? So this is something that goes deep into his psyche, into his consciousness. He was also extremely renowned for his depth of contemplation. So one of the suttas that I've given a reference to at the end of the slide deck is called the Aniruddha Mahavitakka Sutta. So vitakka is reasoning, contemplation, reflection. So the great reflection of Aniruddha. And in that sutta, the story goes that one day Aniruddha is sitting and meditating, and then he thinks to himself that this teaching or the Dhamma would really work for someone with few wishes, not for many wishes. It would work for someone who is contented, rather than if someone is not contented. It would really work for someone who values and appreciates seclusion, rather than someone who's constantly seeking companionship, entertainment, etc. And here, seclusion is not just bodily seclusion, It's also seclusion of the mind. Someone who can still the mind, someone who can quieten the mind, someone who can move the mind away from all of these thoughts that constantly keep coming in. Then he says that this teaching really works for someone who is energetic versus someone who's not energetic or slothful and lazy. This teaching would really work for someone who is mindful rather than someone who's not mindful. Samahitang chittam. This teaching would really work for someone who is collected versus someone who's scattered. And this teaching would also work for someone who's wise rather than someone who is witless and who probably doesn't have that much wisdom. And he's sitting there reflecting on all of these kind of reflections and characteristics of conditions in which the teaching would absolutely shine forth when the Buddha tunes his mind to Aniruddha and then communicates to Aniruddha, well done, Aniruddha, this is really, really good. You have understood the teaching very, very well. But may I add to these 7 points, add this idea of nipapancha, non-proliferation. So the Dhamma would work very well for someone who values non-proliferation over proliferation. And I think this is particularly important, especially given the challenges that we face today, right? The amount of media, the barrage of media, the barrage of things that come and assail our senses, advertisements, devices, billboards, music, this kind of, there's absolutely, unless you come to a place like the Sarana or, a monastery, there's really no escape from something like that, right? So that kind of non-proliferation, the evocative sense of the Dhamma versus this constant going out and seeking and finding, right? So the Buddha then tells him, if anyone were to consult and reflect and work on these 8, the 7 that Aniruddha says, and the last one of non-proliferation, nipapancha, then that person would be able to reach the final goal with a lot of ease. So again, this becomes one of the key teachings of Aniruddha, of themes to reflect on, themes that make the Dhamma really manifest itself as we practice. And of course, as we discussed earlier, he was a master of all the 4 satipatthananas, all the 4 bases of mindfulness. And being someone who is so deeply contemplative, someone who values renunciation a lot, naturally, he comes across in a lot of the suttas as being someone who values seclusion, right? So even though there are suttas where he's part of the Sangha, the Buddha asks him questions, he's conversing with monks, one of the things he's known for is his seclusion. But at the same time, even though he's secluded, he never gives up his responsibilities to the Sangha. He's always there when the Sangha needs him, right? He's there when there's this, he's there when there are certain misunderstandings that arise within the Sangha. There are certain disputes that arise within the Sangha, and the Buddha turns to Aniruddha. There are times after the Buddha's Mahaparinibbana where Aniruddha, along with Maha Kasapa, takes an active role. And I think we'll see that a little down the line. But basically, it is Aniruddha who tells Ananda, go and inform all the people that, the Buddha has passed on. He also gives Aniruddha, well, we'll talk about that in a bit, but yeah, he's always there whenever he's needed. And finally, contentment in the holy life seems to be one of his hallmarks. Whether you read his Theragatha, whether we read some of the suttas in the Majjhima and the Samyutta, he always comes back to the fact that unless the holy life is enjoyed, and unless there is happiness that comes up within oneself as one lives the holy life, it's going to be difficult, right? It's going to be really challenging. So then we talk about Venerable Aniruddha's role in the Sangha. As part of his seclusion and as part of his practice, Venerable Aniruddha takes on 3 ascetic practices. We'll talk about ascetic practices when we talk about Venerable Maha Kasapa, but the 3 practices that Venerable Aniruddha takes on are the practice of wearing rag robes, the practice of going on alms round and eating only what he receives on alms round, and finally, the ascetic practice of not lying down, right? So when he wants to rest, he'll just sit or probably lean on something, never lies down. So he says for 55 years, he never lay down. And for the last 25 years, he never had need for sleep. Right? Says that himself. Which is kind of amazing. I wouldn't recommend, kind of reaching for that very forcefully, but it is kind of inspiring in the sense that, here's this chap who's grown up in the lap of luxury. And then he comes across a teaching, comes across teachers, comes across practitioners. He's so inspired that for 55 years of his life, he doesn't lie down. And for 25 years of his life, he doesn't need sleep. Now, this is possible only when there is a certain amount of collectedness that is achieved by someone. And the depth of his samadhi is probably enough to give his mind and his body the rest that he needs, right? So a lot of young monks kind of take on this practice with a lot of gusto, exhibit A, and then they fall and they pull their back and things don't work really well afterwards. So caution when it comes to that. Venerable Aniruddha is also always seen as his cousin's guide, right? Venerable Aniruddha's guide. So he's the one who tells Aniruddha to go and announce the Venerable Ananda to go around and convey the passing of the Buddha. He's the one who tells, he's the one who actually makes the stipulation at the first council, where there are 499 arahants plus Ananda, and Ananda is required to recite the Sutta Pitaka. It is Aniruddha who says, no, unless Ananda becomes an arahant, he can't join the council. Now, this might seem quite rude or competitive or kind of egging him on, but this comes from a deep understanding. He knows his cousin, right? His cousin Ananda has been this paragon of devotion, this excellent standard of service. Never thinks about himself, never thinks about his own practice. He's always giving, whether it's to the Buddha, whether it's to the Sangha, no time for himself. So now is the time when all of those responsibilities have been kept down. And yet he's sitting isolated in this forest. And instead of really, he just can't be left alone because people are coming and asking him to console them. The Buddha has passed away. Just before that, Pasenadi passes away. Just before that, Sariputta and Moggallana pass away. So there are all of these people who are coming, and he's sitting in the forest. He's trying to meditate, but he can't meditate. He's consoling them. So finally, Aniruddha says, okay, this is the only way it's going to work. Unless this condition, the stipulation is put on, he's never going to be serious about this. Right? So kind of tough love, but much, much appreciated. And of course, Venerable Aniruddha is known to be the foremost when it comes to harmony. Whenever we read, as monks and as nuns, whenever we read the Patimokkha, whenever we read the Vinaya, harmony is probably the foremost condition for which the Vinaya was formed, right? It's to maintain harmony within the Sangha. And Venerable Aniruddha was known to be foremost in harmony. Whichever group of monks he lived with, he was always very, very harmonious. And we'll look at that in a minute. So his hallmark or his main legacy was harmony and non-contention. So when we read any part of the Vinaya Pitaka, it says harmony has three qualities. First is Sammodamana, second is Abhivadamana, and the third is Ekuddesa. And Sammodamana, Modha is to delight. Sammodha is to kind of delight in similar things, same things. Mana is mentality. So if there is a Sangha, if there is a group of monks or nuns living together, then what delights one has to delight the others. If that is achieved, then Avivadamana is automatically achieved. Vivada is argument. Avivada is non-argument, non-contention, non-confrontation. Mana, again, is an attitude. So an attitude of non-contention. Ekuddesa, following one direction, right? Having kind of similar thoughts, having similar goals, having a similar orientation and practice, which is again supported by delighting in things that are delighting in things that delight everyone who lives with you, having this attitude of not arguing, not being the special one, not being superior to everyone else, not being judgmental, etc., etc., and Ekuddesa. And of course, all of this is underpinned with Katanyuta and Katavedita, which is usually translated as gratitude and reciprocity. But Kata is something that is done, Nyu is to know. So Katanyu is simply knowing, recollecting what has been done. Katavedi is the evocative side of it. It is actually feeling in what feeling does this evoke? So here the Vedi comes from Vedana, or Vedana comes from Vedi. Vedi is to experience, it's to know. So Katavedana, so Katanyu, we first think, remember, bring to mind something that someone has done for us, something that is kind, something that is helpful, something that is useful. And then we actually look at what feelings it evokes within the body. So Katanyata and Katavedita, very, very important in the holy life, right? Especially when you're living with a group of people. And we are the recipients of, at least I am the recipient of kindness on numerous occasions on every single day, right? Whether it's by the kindness from the monastics, kindness from the residents, kindness from visitors, there's always kindness. And the more we train ourselves to look at this kindness, remember these kind actions, and actually look at the feelings it evokes, this leads to a lot of harmony within ourselves. And this harmony would again lead to a kind of ease, a kind of relaxation, a kind of non-judgment. And again, this Katanyata, Katavedita, not just, it needn't be outward facing all the time. It can be inward facing too. So if one does something particularly well, one recollects that, one recalls that, brings it to mind, and then actually tries and feels what emotions or what it evokes, right? Venerable Aniruddha was known to, this was probably one of his biggest kind of hallmarks. where he lives with Venerable Kimbala and Venerable Nandiya. The Buddha comes and visits them, and he asks Aniruddha, so Aniruddha, how is it living this holy life? Aniruddha says, well, it's fantastic. I live with these two really lovely venerable monks, and we live as milk mixes with water. There's no separation at all. The Buddha says, okay, how do you do it? And Aniruddha says, well, I think I actually think of all the lovely things that they do for me. I think of the wonderful things that I can do for them. And instead of thinking, why should I do things my own way? I say, let me do things that the others want. And they think the same way too. And then he gives a lot of examples of how they work together. Whoever goes on alms round, they come and they set aside, when they come, the seats are already set. And then whoever eats last clears the refuse, the spittoons and things like that. Examples of how monks live. And it's very, very inspiring, right? But basically, Venerable Aniruddha is known for his harmony and non-contention. And I think now we move on to Venerable Maha Kasapa. It seems a little choppy because we are doing like 3 characters, but like I said, it's story time. So this is the end of Act 1, and we're moving on to Act 2. And in Act 2 enters Venerable Maha Kasapa. Again, one of the foremost characters of the Buddha's students. Venerable Maha Kasapa, again, is born into this family that's very, very well off. And he's kind of heir apparent. There's no spare to this heir. So a lot of his parents' aspirations are kind of pinned on Maha Kasapa. So they want him to get married. They keep pestering him. You need to get a child. The family name has to live on. The usual kind of story, right? Now, Venerable Maha Kasapa has always been inclined to the holy life. He's always been inclined, very, very spiritually inclined. Marriage doesn't draw him. The wealth of his parents doesn't draw him. His inheritance doesn't draw him. So he's kind of saying, he's putting them off. Now, finally, push comes to shove, and his parents say, we can't wait anymore. You've got to get married. So then Maha Kasapa says, okay. And then he has this goldsmith make this beautiful golden image of a woman. He gives it to his parents and tells his parents, if you can find a girl who looks like this image, I'll get married to her. So then the parents say, okay, they see some hope, right? They know this isn't going to be easy, but at least there's some movement in the right direction. So they call 8 Brahmin astrologers, I think, I'm not sure. But anyway, eight people, and they present this image to these 8 people, and they say, go and comb the countryside, and if you find someone who matches this image, then send word. So they go searching, and they finally find this lady called Buddha, who looks like this image. Now, Buddha is as spiritually inclined as Kasapa, right? And she has no intentions of getting married. And she's probably gone through the same things that Kasapa has gone through. And finally, out of having no other choice, said yes. So then the match is fixed. And, the parents send word to each other, and great, this is, they found to be a good match. So matching in probably their family ancestry, matching in social status, whatever. And the alliance is fixed. The wedding is fixed. So then Kasapa writes to Buddha saying, I'm not really interested. So it's very unfair for you to kind of get married to me, because I'm going to go off into the holy life, right? At the same time, the story goes that Buddha sends Kasapa a similar letter saying, look, don't get married to me. I'm not interested. I'm going to go off and live the holy life. The story also goes that these letters are intercepted and replaced by letters of welcome and joy and happiness. So both Mahakasapa and Buddha kind of end up at the marriage altar with heavy hearts. Okay, we've got to do this now. I've tried everything. Everything's failed. Now I have to resign. So they get married, and yet they're so pure in their aspiration that they cannot live a married life to its entirety. They maintain celibacy, right? Even though they're married. And this kind of reminds me of how we spoke about Venerable Shu Yun the last time. Venerable Shu Yun, when he was 16 or something, he was forcibly married to twins. And, you know, he's a 16-year-old guy, and these two are very beautiful looking 16-year-old girls. But still, he is absolutely celibate. And then he convinces them to be celibate, so they become nuns as well. Another great example is Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who is married to Sharada, Mother Sharada, and he looks at her as the divine mother. So instead of having conjugal relations with his wife, puts her on an altar and starts worshipping her as the divine mother. Right? So these are things that happen probably less than 100 years ago. So 150 years ago. So not in that distant past. So then they live a celibate life, and finally Mahakasapa's parents pass away, and the responsibility of maintaining their estates fall on Mahakasapa and Buddha. So one day Kasapa is walking the fields, and then he notices that as the fields are being plowed, all of these earthworms are coming up from the ground. Some of them are killed, and then birds are coming and pecking on them and eating them. And he asks the farmer, he says, you know, who's going to bear the karmic responsibility of all this? The farmer looks at him and says, well, you are, because this is your land. I'm just doing what I'm told to do. You're the one who derives final benefit from this. The intention of all this work is set by you because you're the master. So, you know, any action that's done, wherever the intention arises, that's where the karmic responsibility is going to reside. So now Kasapa starts thinking very deeply. And around the same time, Buddha sees her servants drying out sesame seeds on the ground. And same thing happens. There are a few bugs, and all these birds come and peck on the bugs. And she gets really scared too, because the servant says, well, karmic responsibility is yours. So then they decide, okay, now our parents are no longer alive, and let's go forth. So they go forth and they start walking, and they reach a fork on the road, and each one takes a different path. And we'll talk about Buddha when we do the elder nuns, but Mahakasapa keeps walking, and then he comes across, and the Buddha is able to, you know, he reads what's going on. And then he's waiting for Mahakasapa to arrive. And the Buddha sits there in all his splendor, displaying his 32 great marks. And the suttas say that the Buddha was so splendorous that the entire forest looked like one big mass of light. Now, seeing this, you know, this is probably an image that no one can resist. So Mahakasapa sees this, Kasapa sees this, and prostrates in front of the Buddha and says, you are my teacher. And this is a very touching scene, because the Buddha says, oh Kasapa, there's no one who can equal you in your sincerity. That devotion, that sincerity of Venerable Mahakasapa moves the Buddha that he actually makes the statement on their first meeting that another person to equal your sincerity can't be found. And he goes further to say that if someone says, I know, I have seen, without having known or without having seen, to you, Kasapa, their head would burst into 1,000 pieces. Or in other words, Mahakasapa's sincerity is so strong that no one can pull the wool over his eyes when it comes to their spiritual attainments, or when it comes to their spiritual maturity, spiritual strength, etc. Now, this isn't a kind of a boon that the Buddha gives Kasapa. It's the result of his own sincerity and his own kind of progress, his own spiritual maturity that would allow him to verify or notice the truth in spiritual claims that people make. So then what happens is the Buddha, after telling him this, gives him the going forth then and there and says, come, bhikkhu, come with me. So he becomes a bhikkhu and they start walking. As they start walking, the Buddha says, I'm a little tired, I want to sit down. So then Mahakasapa takes his outer robe, folds it and places it on the ground and asks the Buddha to rest on that. So the Buddha sits down and the Buddha kind of says, oh, this is a nice robe. It's soft. It's nice. And immediately Kasapa says, well, Venerable Sir, may I request you to keep this? Then the Buddha says, okay, then will you take my robe? It's coarse. It's made out of rags that I collected in the charnel ground. It's quite coarse. It's made of hemp. It's rough. It's not as soft as yours. And Mahakasapa says, I would be extremely happy with this. And so the Buddha gives Mahakasapa his own robe and takes Mahakasapa's robe for himself. And of all the Arahants, Venerable Mahakasapa has the singular honor of exchanging robes with the Buddha. You know, it's, as a monk, it's a huge deal. You know, so it's a huge deal. So then the story goes that when the Buddha says, oh, Kasapa, can you manage with this coarse robe? The story goes that that was the Buddha's way of telling Mahakasapa that he has to live a life of asceticism. Okay, and we'll see that later. His unique strengths are that he is the only monk who is known to have been equal to the Buddha. And especially after the Buddha passes away, there's actually, I think this is commentarial, but he is one of the monks who is actually considered to be equal to the Buddha in terms of his abilities, and we'll look at those details a little further down the line. And he is also known to be the foremost in the Dhutangas, in ascetic living. Okay. There are lots of stories in which Venerable Mahakasapa comes across as very direct, right? Sometimes some of the things that one reads, one thinks, my God, he's probably very grumpy, right? But it just seems that way. The way things pan out, even with his very direct, very kind of cutting way of speech, the results are really good. Okay, and we'll look at some of those examples as we go along. So when the Buddha takes on Venerable Mahakasapa as his student, he tells Kasapa, he gives Kasapa this triple exhortation, or 3 pieces of advice. He says, have conscience and concern towards everyone in the Sangha, be they senior, be they junior, or be they equal. listen, examine, reflect, and absorb all the teachings, everything that you hear that is conducive to unbinding. And these two kind of indicate that probably Venerable Maha Kasapa could be a little on the judgmental side, right? He knows that the Buddha is his teacher and therefore is really loyal to the teachings of the Buddha and probably discounts everything else and everyone else. So the Buddha is actually warning. It could also be that he's such an ascetic that he probably doesn't want anything to do with anyone else. The Buddha tells him, no, you've got to get along with people, whether they're senior, whether they're junior, or whether they're your equals. You have to get along with people. So always treat people with conscience and concern. If someone tells you something that's conducive to unbinding, you have to really take that to heart. And finally, the final exhortation is that Kasapa do not neglect mindfulness of the body coupled with gladness. And this is because the Buddha recognizes Maha Kasapa's inherent streak of asceticism. And to prevent him from becoming this kind of dried up old prune, he says, no, you've got to find gladness. You've got to find that joy. You've got to find piti and pasadi that go along with mindfulness of the body. So again, his persona, the exchange of robes, we just spoke about that. He was the father of the Sangha, right? Father of the Sangha because he convenes the first council. He is also the senior most monk after the Buddha's Mahaparinibbana. So there's the Sangha that's newly orphaned, and Maha Kasapa automatically takes charge because of his, not only because of his seniority, but also because of his inherent enthusiasm in maintaining the authenticity of the Buddha's teachings. Right? And if he hadn't convened that first council, we probably wouldn't have had the Vinaya Pitaka and the Sutta Pitaka. So he is known as the father of the Sangha. And he's in more than one sutta, he is addressed as Buddha Patibhaga Savaka. And this is what I spoke about 2 slides ago, where he is known to be almost equal to the Buddha. Patibhaga means equal in quantity. Buddha of the Buddha, Savaka is a monk or a samana. So this is the title that he's been given, right? And that's why a lot of canonical sources actually put him, they say that he's comparable to the Buddha in terms of his teachings and whatever, because of this title that he has, Buddha Patibhaga Savaka. The title that the Buddha, the recognition that the Buddha actually gives him is Dutavada Ananyatadaggan, which means the monk foremost in the Dutangas. And he's also recognized as someone who moves from abundance to abundance. So he was born into abundance. His family was very rich, never wanted for anything. And then his monastic life was extremely abundant too. Abundant in terms of his contentment with the holy life, abundant with the recognition from the Buddha. In fact, in one sutta, I think the reference is given in the last slide. The Buddha actually recognizes that Maha Kasapa is going to outlive Sariputta and Mahamoggallana. And he really starts praising Maha Kasapa at that point. And he tells all the monks, follow Kasapa as an example. After me, Kasapa is the one that you have to follow. As there was the triple this is one of the really interesting things that brings out Mahakasapa's traits. As with the triple exhortation, there's also this triple refusal. The Buddha asks Mahakasapa to teach 3 times, and 3 times Mahakasapa refuses. And the first time he says, the Buddha says, Kasapa, teach the monks. Mahakasapa says, I'm sorry, Lord, I can't teach them. These monks are not open to admonishment. Avachaniya karana. These monks are not open to admonishment. They don't respect their elders. If someone advises them to do something, they're not able to take it. So the Buddha listens and, okay, fine. Second time, Buddha tells him, at another occasion, Buddha tells him to teach. And he says, I'm sorry, Lord, I can't teach this group of monks because they are lacking in confidence, saddha. They are lacking in conscience and concern, hiri and uttapa. They are lacking in virya. They don't have the energy that's needed to put forth for practice, and they are lacking in wisdom. And so I can't teach. The Buddha says, okay, at that time too. Then the third time, at another occasion, Mahakasapa is asked to teach, and the Buddha says, Buddha asks him to teach, and Mahakasapa refuses. And so the Buddha actually says, yes, Kasapa, you are right. Earlier, we had monks who were very content, who wore only the 3 robes, who would eat from the bowl, who would go on alms round, who would live secluded, and who'd be content with very little. And they were the models for all the young monks. They were the standard for the young monks to emulate. Now, it is monks who are famous, who have a lot of renown. So Yasa is fame, Kiti is renown, Janapiyata, who are very popular with people, Mahadana, who have a lot of wealth. That means they're offered a lot of requisites, and Bahulaya, who are used to living a luxurious life. Only these monks are now set as standards or recognized as standards of emulation. And so, Kasapa, yes, there has been decline in the sasana, there has been decline in the Sangha. So you're actually right not to teach. Right? Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So then we come to what are these ascetic practices? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically the word for ascetic practice, the Pali word is dhutanga. And dhu actually means to shake, and anga means a part or something that shakes. And what is it that's shaken? It's the defilements that are shaken. It is actually raga, dosa, and moha. So anything that has a root in sensuality, in greed, in aversion, or in delusion. Anything that has roots in this, these dhutangas are supposed to be shaken off. They are 13 in number. It is not compulsory for monks to practice these dhutangas, but they are voluntary. Now, in the Lumpucha Sangha, in all his wisdom, Lumpucha has set up our Sangha in such a way that we automatically follow a lot of the dhutangas. So the dhutangas that we follow are that we are triple robe wearers. We don't have more than one. We don't keep like 3 sangatis and 3 double robes and 3 upper robes. Or we don't have a large wardrobe, right? We eat from a bowl. We eat once a day, and it's a single sitting. So we serve ourselves once, and then after that one time, we don't eat. Then there are other more strenuous dhutangas like not lying down, living at the foot of a tree, living in a charnel ground, etc., etc., right? But these are basically to target our defilements. And the idea of dhutangas is to arouse an energy, arouse an enthusiasm, kind of create a little bit of the tension in the middle way. And it shouldn't come from an intention of wanting to battle the kilesas or kill the kilesas or get rid of the kilesas in a way that brings up a lot of vibhava tanha within. right? So that's a little note on the Dhutangas. So then what happens is Mahakasapa gets on in age, and then Mahakasapa goes to meet the Buddha at one point, and the Buddha looks at Mahakasapa and he notices that Mahakasapa is old. But Mahakasapa, being Mahakasapa, always wears rag robes. He lives at the foot of a tree. He does not accept meal invitations. So the Buddha asks him, Kasapa, why do you live this way? Why don't you start accepting robes that lay people offer you? Why don't you accept invitations to meals when people invite you? Why don't you come to the monastery and live beside me? And Mahakasapa says, Lord, respectfully, I have to refuse. I can't live the way you asked me to live. So Buddha says, why? And he says, well, I live this way because of two reasons. For my own pleasant abiding here and now. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. This is how I'm used to living. And, this is what gives me a lot of joy. This is what gives me a lot of satisfaction. So please allow me to live this way. And out of compassion for later generations. So when younger monks come into the Sangha, and when they hear that there is someone who's lived life in such a way, they might think to emulate it. Right? The softness and the humility in the statement really, really touches my heart. And the Pali is equally beautiful, right? And he doesn't say, I live this way for future generations to emulate. He doesn't say, I live this way so that future generations are inspired. He says, no. I live this way in the hope that someone down the line might hear of this life and they might think to emulate it. Right? Really beautiful. The softness is fantastic. So then, once the Buddha hears this, he gives Kasapa the ultimate compliment. He says, this, our Kasapa, is satisfied with whatever robes, alms food, lodging, and medicine he obtains. For the sake of these, he will not do anything that is unbefitting for a monk. If he does not obtain any of these requisites, he isn't perturbed. When he obtains them, he makes use of them without clinging or infatuation, not committing any fault, aware of possible dangers, and knowing them as an escape from bodily affliction. Right? And, responsible use of requisites. This is exactly it. If you have it, well and good. You use it in a way that it gives maximum benefit, but at the same time, not hankering after it, not kind of delighting in it. By the example of Kasapa, by the example of Kasapa, or by one who equals him, I will exhort you, monks. So thus admonished, you should practice in the same way. Right? And so after this is mentioned in the suttas, that's when the statement comes that, he's the Buddha Patibhaga Savaka. He is almost on equal footing, comparable to the Buddha. So then what happens after the Buddha's Mahaparinibbana? There's no kind of relevance to this picture. I just loved it when I was doing a search of images and I put it on. So it has no relevance, right? It's just a beautiful picture. So Mahakasapa is out he's wandering with this group of monks, and he's making his way from this place called Pava to Rajagaha, and he meets a naked ascetic, an Ajivaka, who has this really special kind of flower, and this flower is not available in the earthly realm at all times. So immediately Kasapa senses that something really important has happened. So he asks the ascetic, what happens? And the ascetic says, well, the Buddha, your teacher, has attained Mahaparinibbana a week ago. So then what happens is, in that group of monks that he's traveling with, a lot of them start crying. But there's this one monk called Subhadda who has ordained late in life. He says, oh, the Buddha is gone. So now no one can no longer tell us, oh, this is permissible, this is not permissible, this is how you should live, this is not how you should live. Now we can live in any which way we want. And this really, really shakes Maha Kasapa up and worries him a lot. So anyway, at that moment, he doesn't say anything. He just consoles those who need to be consoled with the admonishment that, hey, look, even the Buddha has said that anything that is born has to die. His death is perfectly natural. So let's carry on. And so they go on. The funeral pyre is all set up. Venerable Aniruddha is there. Venerable Ananda is there. And somehow the pyre doesn't light, right? No one's able to light the pyre. Then Aniruddha uses his clairvoyance and then he tells everyone, please wait, there are certain deities here who can't be seen, but they're waiting for Maha Kasapa to arrive. And only when Maha Kasapa arrives and pays his respects to the bodily remains of the Buddha can the funeral start. So then finally Maha Kasapa arrives, he circumambulates the pyre where the Buddha's bodily remains are kept. He does his final prostration. His group of monks circumambulate and prostrate. As soon as that happens, the funeral pyre lights itself. Okay. Even though Maha Kasapa has been really, really stern to Ananda, and there are two examples where he's been very, very stern, and both of them involve sharp comments from two nuns, Tullatissa and Tulla something else. I forget. Anyway, these two nuns make kind of remarks that are not really warranted. And Maha Kasapa warns Ananda about it. And on another occasion, 30 of Venerable Ananda's new disciples disrobe. And Ananda is out on Tudong. And then Tudong is the Thai word for Dutanga. It also means to go wandering, right? So Ananda comes back and Maha Kasapa gives him a little bit of a teaching there, an admonishment there. He says, you know, when you have such new students who are not really well-versed in etiquette, they have no control over their desires, they have no control over, over how much food they should eat, they have no control over how much they should practice. You can't take these guys and go on Tudong. You're giving the sasana a bad name. And Ananda kind of agrees. So there are a couple of instances where Maha Kasapa comes across as very stern to Ananda. But then when the Buddha passes away, it is Maha Kasapa who tells Ananda, go to the forest now. Your responsibilities are done. Now is the time for seclusion. Now is the time for you to practice. So if Maha Kasapa was always, if Maha Kasapa was just kind of being grumpy or grouchy or rude, there was no need for him to have advised Ananda in this way. But this is another example of how whatever he has done or said has a good result. Right? So then Ananda goes to the forest, he practices. Finally, when it's time, and then Aniruddha puts that condition that during the first council, he should be an arahant. So if it wasn't for Maha Kasapa's advice for Ananda to go to the forest, his practice would never have started. Right? So then convening the council, as soon as the funeral is over, Maha Kasapa says, okay, now it's time to act on what Subhadda has said. And he says, we have to really protect the teachings. We have to keep the authentic Dhamma alive, because if monks and nuns are allowed to do whatever they want, this thing's going to come crashing down. So he convenes the council, he presides over the council, And then at the end of the council, he presents the Buddha's alms bowl to Ananda. This is there in the Pali Canon, as a kind of sign or recognition of Ananda being a bowl that catches the Buddha's teachings, right? So Maha Kasapa gives Ananda the bowl. Now, in the northern traditions, the story is that now Maha Kasapa still has that robe that the Buddha has given him at their first meeting. He's never let go. He hasn't let go of that. So he goes on to this mountain, sits there in meditation, and the mountain closes up because he's waiting for the next Buddha, Buddha Maitreya, to come, and he will present this robe to Buddha Maitreya. And that story is from the northern tradition. Maha Kasapa is also considered one of the Zen patriarchs, just like how the southern tradition venerates Sariputta and Moggallana, the northern tradition venerates Maha Kasapa and Ananda. Okay, and Maha Kasapa is the patriarch, the first patriarch of the Chan school. Finally, it's 8:20, so we haven't done too badly. We come to Venerable Angulimala. So the reason why Angulimala is the reason why it's important to kind of talk about Angulimala is because of the fact that there's always opportunity to change. The story also shows that no one is completely bad. There is inherent goodness in everyone. Given the right causes and conditions, both their bad qualities will arise and their good qualities will arise at different points, given causes and conditions. So I thought it's nice to kind of, he was a fully realized disciple of the Buddha, and usually there's not much that's spoken about him. But anyway, so he is born to the royal chaplain of King Pasenadi of Kosala. Okay, and his name, the chaplain's name is Bhagava Gagga, so Bhargava Garga in Sanskrit, and his wife's name is Manthan. And so when he was born, they read his horoscope, and the person who reads his horoscope tells Bhargava that, look, your son is going to be trouble. He's going to be prone to violence. He's going to be prone to thievery. So be warned. So now the royal chaplain's really upset. He goes to Pasenadi the next morning and says, how did you sleep? So Pasenadi says, well, all my divine weapons lit up in the night. They were sparkling as if they were kind of ready for action. So then Bhargava says, well, that's because, my wife gave birth to a son, and this guy is supposed to have this really strong propensity towards violence and thievery. So that's why your divine weapons were kind of itching to get into action or whatever. So then Bhargava asks Pasenadi, should we just kill the child? So Pasenadi says, well, do you know if he's going to be a thief that's going to lead a large gang, or is he going to operate alone? So Bhargava says, well, I think he's going to operate alone. So Pasenadi says, okay, give him a chance. Don't kill him. Try and raise him well. Try a little bit of reverse psychology. See if he changes. So then what they do is they name him Ahimsaka, the harmless one. And because he has this propensity for violence, they name him Ahimsaka. They bring him up always exposed to good things in life, exposed to virtue, exposed to spiritual practice, things like that. And he's growing up to be a really good boy. He's learning very well. He's not displaying any violent traits. And so they decide to send him to Takshila, which is one of the great universities that existed at the time. So they send him to Takshila, and there he is accepted as a pupil by one of the foremost teachers. What happens there is that all the other students get very jealous of Ahimsaka. He's doing so well. that teacher kind of just takes him on as his own son. So teaches him, spends a lot of time with him, makes sure he learns everything. Now, all of these students get jealous and they kind of poison the teacher's heart and mind. They tell him, watch out, this guy is learning everything from you, and then at some point he's going to push you out, right? And he's going to take your place. So now this teacher kind of observes Ahimsaka a little bit, and the suspicion takes root. Says, okay, this guy, I've got to somehow send him away. Now, Ahimsaka is also a really strong, muscular, kind of active kind of guy. It's not very easy to physically harm him. So the teacher says, okay, now your education is over. As the fee for my teaching, and if you want to extract the full value of this teaching, you have to make an offering to me and to the sciences you have learned. So I need you to get me 1,000 little fingers from 1,000 human hands. So at first, Ahimsaka is shocked. He says, no, I come from a family that's very, very peaceful. I've been raised to be a peaceful person. How can you ask me to do this? So the teacher says, no, this is my fee. You've got to pay. And this is the condition that allows his violent streak to manifest, his inherent violence, his tendency towards violence to emerge. And the commentaries actually say, if he had gone from charnel ground to charnel ground, he could have easily collected these 1,000 little fingers and he could have taken them to his teacher. But he chooses to kill his victims and then take these little fingers. And so what happens is he goes away from his teacher. He comes back to Magadha, and in Magadha, there's this forest called the Jalini forest, and he makes that his kind of place of operation. So he stands on top of a cliff, and then whenever he sees people walking, he'll rush down, kill them, and take their little finger. And so he would string them on a string, and then wear them around his neck. And from that point in time, he was called Angulimala. Anguli is finger, Mala is garland. So he was called Angulimala. So then he keeps doing that. And he has collected 999 little fingers. He has one last finger to collect. Around this time, all the people go to King Pasenadi and say, oh, there's this brigand called Angulimala. He's terrible. He's killing everyone who goes to the forest. So Pasenadi then sends a detachment of his army to go and deal with Angulimala. Now, no one knows who Angulimala is. No one knows that he's Ahimsaka, that he's Bhargava's and Mantani's son. They just think that this guy's come from somewhere and he's called Angulimala. But then his mother there's a voice that tells her, this is your son. So she gets really scared that the king's army is going to go and get him. So she says, let me go and warn my son. The mother's heart, out of all her love and out of her compassion, she goes, knowing that she might fall victim to him. So he's up there and he sees and, oh my God, that's my mother. She's coming. I need one more finger. So at that time, it doesn't strike him that, matricide is possibly one of the worst sins that one can do. It doesn't, his violent streak is so strong. It's been fed by him killing 998 other people that he's ready to go down. As he's ready to go down, the Buddha appears between him and his mother. And then Angulimala thinks, okay, all I need is one little finger. Why should I kill my own mother? I'll kill this recluse and take his finger. And the Buddha is just walking along in his own gate. And Angulimala is running behind him. And even though it appears as if the Buddha is just walking along in his normal gait, Angulimala is still not able to catch up. And, you know, in the in one of the Parittas, it's said very beautifully that Angulimala runs behind the Buddha for 3 yojanas. A lot of kilometers. Sorry, I can't do the math right now. Many kilometers. Tiyojana Patangulimala Vantam. He follows the Buddha. He runs behind the Buddha for 3 yojanas, and he's still not able to catch up with the Buddha. And it just seems as if the Buddha is walking at his normal pace. So he gets alarmed and he yells out, "Recluse, stop!" And the Buddha just turns around, and it seems as if the Buddha is still walking. And the Buddha says, "I have stopped. Now you stop too, Angulimala." And, you know, this kind of really, it strikes at Angulimala's heart. But still, he's not able to understand. He says, "Look, I've stopped running. I'm telling you to stop. It looks as if you're still walking. And then you tell me that you've stopped and I have to stop. I've already stopped. You're the one who hasn't." So the Buddha says, "No, Angulimala, I have stopped permanently. I have stopped harming. I have stopped killing. I have stopped everything. Now it's time for you to stop." Then Angulimala realizes that this is no ordinary being. This is no ordinary recluse. This isn't an ordinary monk. Out of using his psychic powers, he's able to kind of still time and extend space in such a way that it appears as if he's just walking, but the distance seems to be great. How much ever speed that Angulimala puts forth, he's not able to catch up. So he takes refuge in the Buddha and says, "Please give me the going forth." Right? And the Buddha gives him the going forth and calls him Gagga Mantani Putta. Garga in honor of his father, Mantani Putta, son of Mantani, in honor of his mother, and takes him to Jetavana in Savatthi. Now, Savatthi is the capital of King Pasenadi. Savatthi is the capital of Kosala. Everyone there knows Angulimala. The Buddha takes him to Jetavana and makes him his own attendant. Huge honor, right, for this serial killer. Now the Buddha knows that the change has happened. When the Buddha asked him that question, the conditions that allowed all the goodness, inherent goodness in Angulimala to come out have now ripened. And so all of his violence goes down, and in their place arises compassion, arises repentance, arises love, arises all the Brahma Viharas, right? And so what happens at Jetavana is that whenever he goes out on alms round, people see him and they recognize him, even though he's shaved his head and he's donned robes and he's carrying an alms bowl. People still know him because, you know, he's killed their husband or his wife or their parents or their child. So as soon as he enters any of the streets, people run in and shut the door because they're scared. And so he really feels this. He feels, you know, I have to go out on alms round. No one's giving me alms. I don't get even a spoonful of rice or a ladleful of gruel. And this is because of my past actions. This is my karma catching up with me. But still, here's what I have to do. I have to go on alms round. This is how this life is lived. So he doesn't give up, keeps going on alms round. And one day, as he's going on alms round, he sees this woman who's struggling to give birth. And obviously, this is a very complicated pregnancy. So his heart just opens to the scene. You know, here's a guy who's been so violent, he's killed 998 people. And then he sees this woman, and then he's met the Buddha. The Buddha's words have affected him so deeply that when he sees this woman struggling to give birth to a baby, all in response, there's this overflowing of karuna, this overflowing of metta. So he goes to the Buddha and he says, "Oh Lord, what should I do? I want to help this woman. She's really struggling in childbirth." So the Buddha says, "Okay, go and tell her that since my birth, I have never knowingly harmed or killed any living being." Now Angulimala is shocked, says, "How can I say that? That's lying." So the Buddha says, "Okay, then you go and say, because of your noble, or after your noble and spiritual birth, you have never intentionally harmed or killed any living." So now Angulimala says, "Fine, this I can say." And the Buddha says, "Not only do you say this, you say of noble and spiritual, or after my noble and spiritual birth, I have never intentionally harmed or killed any living being. And if the statement is true, may your delivery be peaceful. May you get your baby easily, and may you be well and healthy, and may your baby be well and healthy." So now Angulimala goes and makes the statement, and the delivery happens. The mother is healthy, the baby is healthy, and everyone around looks and realizes that this is a changed being. This being that has so much of hatred is now full of metta and karuna, and hence is worthy of respect, worthy of offerings, worthy of hospitality. Ahunayo, pahunayo, dakinayo, anjali karanayo, worthy of, bowing down. So they recognize that. And this also then creates a kind of a feeling of security with people. And things go along for a while. Angulimala goes on alms round, people feed him. Yet there are some people who still bear a grudge. So one day, as he's going on alms round, they beat him with stones, they pelt him with stones, and they beat him with sticks, and he's very, very badly hurt. His bowl is cracked, his robe is torn, he's bleeding all over. But yet, he doesn't want to give up his own life. He wants to go and pay respects to the Buddha one final time. So he hangs on to dear life, and he goes to the Buddha, and the Buddha sees him coming. And the Buddha exclaims, "Bear it, Brahman, bear it. Don't give up." Giving him the encouragement that, okay, if you didn't bear with all of this, you might have to spend many hundreds or thousands of years in the hellfire because of the karma of all your past actions. Now this karma has come to you in this form, just bear it and attain nibbana. So having had the spiritual maturity and having had the kind of vision and understanding, Angulimala then bears it and lets go of his life and passes on as an arahant. So that's the story of Angulimala, and we are 7 minutes late. So anyway, here are the references. If there are any questions, please go ahead. If not, you can email Marjorie or Nithya.
Thank you. Thank you, Ven Amarasiri. That was